Discovering the Suttas Without Misreading, opening section. This book did not begin with a new interpretation of the Buddha's teaching. It began with discomfort. Again and again, the suttas were read carefully, faithfully, even reverently. And yet, something felt off. Practice felt heavy. Effort escalated. Mindfulness became tense. Intention hardened into control. Freedom was spoken of often, but it seemed strangely distant. The problem did not feel like a lack of sincerity. It did not feel like laziness. It did not feel like insufficient discipline. It felt as though something quieter had gone wrong. This book is written from that recognition. Many of the difficulties practitioners face do not arise because the suttas are misunderstood in content. They arise because the suttas are misunderstood in mode. They are read as the wrong kind of thing. Instructions are heard as descriptions. Structural explanations are taken as timelines. Functional tools are treated as ontological claims. And when that happens, something subtle shifts. The Dhamma does not fail, but it stops functioning as intended. The Buddha's teaching was not designed to explain reality. It was designed to end suffering. That difference matters. When the teaching is handled as explanation, it invites belief, argument, identity. When it is handled as instruction, it invites application, discernment, release. This book is an attempt to restore that original handling. At the center of this inquiry stands a single discourse, Majjhima Nikāya 8, the Sallekha Sutta, not because it is more important than the others, but because it makes something unusually clear. Liberation is not achieved by force, not by purification, not by accumulating refined states. It is achieved by reorienting the conditions that govern the mind. MN8 quietly refuses many of our assumptions. It rejects calm as the measure of progress. It refuses to equate effort with struggle. It does not promise that defilements will never arise. Instead, it shows something more subtle. It shows how their authority can be removed. Read carefully. The sutta is not teaching moral perfection. It is teaching navigation. Imagine sailing. You do not control the wind. You do not command the sea. Storms do not negotiate. And yet, navigation is possible. Experienced sailors cross oceans. Inexperienced sailors run aground within sight of shore. The difference is not strength. It is setup. The Buddha did not teach us to control the ocean. He taught us how to sail. If this book succeeds, it will not leave you with more to do. It will leave you with less to carry. And perhaps that is the most faithful outcome a book on the Buddha's teaching can offer. Chapter 1. The silent category error. Most confusion around the Buddha's teaching does not come from carelessness. It does not come from lack of intelligence. It does not come from lack of sincerity. It does not come from lack of effort. In fact, the confusion often appears most strongly among serious practitioners, people who read carefully. Practice diligently. Think deeply. The problem lies elsewhere. It lies in something almost invisible, a silent category error. A mistake so subtle that it usually goes unnoticed, and yet powerful enough to invert the function of the teaching itself. The suttas are being read in the wrong mode. And once that happens, even correct understanding at the level of words leads to incorrect results in practice. This chapter names that error. Structural teachings. Misread as temporal. The Buddha's teaching is overwhelmingly structural, not temporal. A structural teaching explains how something functions, what conditions support it, what keeps it operating, what happens when those supports are withdrawn. A temporal teaching, by contrast, explains events unfolding over time. First, this happens, then that happens. Eventually, something else follows. The Buddha teaches structure. Readers instinctively hear time. When structure is misread as time, teachings meant to reveal leverage are transformed into timelines. Instead of seeing how suffering is upheld right now by specific conditions, practitioners begin to imagine processes that must unfold gradually, sequentially, perhaps even across lifetimes. Intervention is postponed. Responsibility subtly weakens. Practice becomes endurance rather than understanding. This is how dependent arising turns from a diagnostic map into a cosmic story. This is how the path turns into a ladder. This is how liberation starts to feel distant rather than immediate. Nothing in the teaching explicitly says this, but the temporal frame quietly imposes itself. Instructions, mistaken for descriptions. Closely tied to this is a second misreading. Instructions are mistaken for descriptions. An instruction tells you what to do to change a situation. A description tells you what is the case regardless of what you do. Much of the Dhamma is instructional. This should be understood. This should be abandoned. This should be cultivated. These are not statements about the universe. They are invitations to intervene, but readers often hear them as declarations about reality. When the Buddha points to impermanence, he is not primarily saying, reality is impermanent. He is instructing the practitioner to attend to instability here so that clinging cannot stabilize. When this is misheard as a description of how things ultimately are, the teaching shifts from practice to philosophy. Insight becomes belief. Belief becomes identity. The words remain the same. The function reverses. Tools mistaken for truths. From here, a third distortion follows naturally. Tools are mistaken for truths. The Buddha repeatedly presents frameworks, lists, divisions, analytical schemes. These are not final explanations of reality. They are instruments, designed for specific tasks, diagnosing clinging, interrupting appropriation, stabilizing release. But once instruction becomes description, tools are promoted into doctrines. The 5 aggregates become components of a person. Dependent arising becomes a metaphysical law. The path becomes a worldview. And when tools are treated as truths, people defend them, argue over them, build identities around them. The very frameworks meant to loosen identification begin to reinforce it. A tool does not stop being useful when it is put down. It stops being useful when it is clung to. Functional teachings, mistaken for ontological claims. At the deepest level, all of these errors collapse into one. Functional teachings are mistaken for ontological claims. The Buddha consistently asks functional questions. What sustains suffering? What feeds it? What interrupts it? What happens when support is removed? Readers keep trying to extract answers to ontological questions instead. What really exists? What am I, fundamentally? What is the ultimate nature of reality? This shift is not innocent. Ontology invites ownership. Ownership invites defense. Defense hardens identity. Identity sustains suffering. The Dhamma is not trying to explain what is. It is trying to show what does and how to stop it. Why smart people get stuck here. This is why intelligent, thoughtful, and committed practitioners are often the most vulnerable to misreading. They understand the words, they grasp the concepts, they can explain the teachings clearly. But they are operating in the wrong category. Once a teaching is miscategorized, as description instead of instruction, as timeline instead of structure, as truth instead of tool, further intelligence only deepens the problem. The practitioner becomes very good at explaining something that is no longer functioning as intended. This is why debates proliferate while suffering persists. This is why effort increases while freedom feels distant. This is why practice becomes heavy. The key insight. The core problem can be stated very simply. Most confusion is not misunderstanding. It is miscategorization. The suttas are not being read incorrectly. They are being read as the wrong kind of thing. Even when strong imagery appears, taming, training, restraint, these two function structurally, not as endorsements of inner warfare. The chapters that follow will show how this miscategorization plays out in lived experience, how intention becomes will, how effort becomes strain, how mindfulness becomes surveillance, and how one sutta in particular quietly corrects all of it, not by argument, but by restoring the proper mode of reading. Before changing practice, the way of reading must change. Chapter 2. When practice turns into policing. When practice turns into audiobook version. For many practitioners, something quietly goes wrong long before doubt appears, long before burnout. Practice begins with sincerity. There is inspiration, trust in the teachings, a genuine wish to be free from suffering. At first, effort feels purposeful, mindfulness feels clarifying, intention feels wholesome. Then slowly, the tone changes. The mind tightens. Practice becomes serious, in a strained way. There is an unspoken sense of being evaluated from the inside. Anger still arises, desire still arises, restlessness still arises, and instead of curiosity, a new response appears. This shouldn't be happening. This is the moment when practice stops being training and starts becoming policing. How intention becomes will. Right intention was never meant to be heavy. In the Suttas, it functions as orientation, an inclination toward non-harm, toward non-ill will, toward relinquishment. It sets direction without micromanaging movement. But when instruction is misread as description, intention quietly shifts roles. Instead of orienting the mind, it begins to judge it. Right intention is no longer felt as the mind is inclined away from harm. It becomes, I must have pure intentions. Unwholesome impulses are no longer seen as unsupported conditions. They are taken as personal failures. The practitioner begins checking motives, correcting thoughts, monitoring inner states. This is will, not intention. Will forces. It tightens. It overrides resistance. And once will takes over, the mind splits. There is a controller and something being controlled. Practice now requires constant vigilance, not to understand the mind, but to keep it in line. The Buddha never taught this split, but it arises naturally once intention is moralized. How effort becomes struggle. Something similar happens with effort. Right effort was never meant to feel heroic. It regulates momentum. It prevents certain conditions from gaining traction. It allows other conditions to stabilize. It works through adjustment, not force. But when the path is misread as a timeline, something that must be pushed forward, effort turns into struggle. Now effort means doing more, trying harder, fixing faster. When unwholesome states arise, the response is immediate resistance. When wholesome states fade, anxiety follows. Practice becomes labor. Ironically, the harder one tries, the more effort seems necessary. Struggle feeds on itself. Fatigue appears. And because the teaching is assumed to be correct, the practitioner concludes, I'm not doing enough. What was meant to reduce strain now amplifies it. How mindfulness becomes surveillance. Mindfulness suffers perhaps the most damaging transformation. Originally, mindfulness functions to keep experience observable, to prevent automatic identification, to prevent unconscious reaction. It allows phenomena to be seen without being owned. But when intention becomes will and effort becomes struggle, mindfulness is recruited as an enforcement tool. Instead of awareness, it becomes monitoring. The practitioner tries to watch everything, every thought, every feeling, every impulse. There is a sense of being constantly on duty, scanning for mistakes. Mindfulness no longer feels spacious. It feels intrusive. This is surveillance, not sati. And surveillance always implies an authority watching a subject. The watcher becomes more solid. The sense of me doing the practice becomes stronger, not weaker. Again, the result is the opposite of what was intended. Why tension, guilt, and exhaustion appear. When practice turns into policing, the emotional cost is predictable. Tension arises because the mind is being forced into shapes it cannot sustain. Guilt arises because natural mental events are interpreted as moral failures. Exhaustion arises because constant control is unsustainable. Many practitioners carry these states quietly. They assume this is what serious practice feels like. Some even wear it as a badge of commitment. Others slowly drift away, concluding that the path is too demanding, too rigid, too incompatible with ordinary life. Rarely do they suspect the real issue. The problem is not insufficient effort. The problem is that effort has been misassigned. The Buddha did not design the path to be a psychological surveillance system. He designed it to dismantle the conditions that make surveillance seem necessary. When the teachings are read in the wrong category, practice becomes self-management. When they are read correctly, practice becomes release from management. This chapter is not yet offering solutions. It is naming something, a feeling many practitioners recognize but rarely articulate. The next step is to see how this policing arises, not from the teachings themselves, but from the way they are read, and how one sutta, read structurally and functionally, quietly restores the path to its intended lightness. Before learning how to sail, one must first realize that rowing against the ocean was never required. Chapter 3. Why time is not the problem. Structure is. When practice begins to feel heavy, delayed, or out of reach, the explanation often sounds simple. This takes time. Liberation is imagined as something distant. Understanding is expected to mature gradually. Defilements are tolerated as part of a long unfolding process. Responsibility is postponed into the future. Time, it seems, has become the central factor. And yet, The Buddha almost never teaches liberation as a matter of waiting. The problem is not time. The problem is how teachings are being read. Specifically, how structural teachings are mistaken for temporal ones. This mistake is subtle, persuasive, and deeply embedded in the way we think. Structural reading versus temporal reading. A structural reading asks, what conditions are supporting this right now? What happens if a support is removed? Where does leverage exist? A temporal reading asks something different. What comes first? What comes next? How long will this take? The Buddha teaches structure. Readers instinctively hear time. When structure is read as time, teachings meant to expose how suffering operates are transformed into stories about how suffering unfolds. Instead of identifying what sustains a pattern, practitioners begin waiting for the pattern to complete itself, or slowly wear out. This is not a harmless shift. It changes everything about how practice is approached. Why dependent arising is not a timeline. Nowhere is this misreading more damaging than in dependent arising. Structurally read, dependent arising shows how suffering is upheld. With ignorance as support, certain patterns function. With that support removed, they cannot. Each link answers a functional question. What does this depend on? What does it enable? But when read temporally, the same teaching becomes a sequence. First ignorance happens, then formations arise, then consciousness follows, and so on, sometimes stretched across years, sometimes across lifetimes. Once this happens, the teaching loses its immediacy. Instead of asking, where is ignorance functioning right now, the practitioner wonders where they are in the chain. Instead of removing a condition, they wait for a stage to pass. The structure that was meant to reveal leverage now obscures it. Why the gradual path is misheard as waiting. The Buddha does speak of gradual training, but gradual does not mean passive, and it does not mean temporal inevitability. Gradual training refers to layered refinement of conditions, not to the passage of time itself. Ethics stabilizes attention. Stabilized attention allows discernment. Discernment reveals appropriation. Appropriation, once seen clearly, loses its grip. Nothing here requires waiting. Yet when the path is heard temporally, gradual becomes eventually. Liberation becomes a destination. Practice becomes something endured rather than something understood. This is how practitioners learn patience, but lose precision. How time sneaks in, and responsibility sneaks out. Temporal framing does something subtle to responsibility. If suffering is understood structurally, then responsibility lies in seeing which supports are active now. Intervention is possible now. Withdrawal of support has immediate effects. But if suffering is understood temporally, responsibility becomes diluted. One is always early in the process. Or not ready yet, or still progressing. Action is deferred. Insight is postponed. Effort becomes endurance. No one explicitly teaches this deferral. It emerges naturally once structure is replaced by time. This is why practice can feel sincere, yet strangely inert. One is doing everything right, and yet nothing decisive seems to change. Why this matters. Before MN8, before turning fully to the Sallekha Sutta, this distinction must be clear. MN8 does not describe a sequence of purification over time. It does not promise that defilements will gradually disappear if one waits long enough. It does not praise endurance. Instead, it describes a structural reorientation, a way of setting things up so that unwholesome states lose governing power regardless of when they arise. If MN8 is read temporally, it will sound like moral effort stretched across time. If it is read structurally, it becomes a precise instruction for immediate leverage. The difference is not small. It determines whether practice feels heavy or light, delayed or direct. Time is not the enemy. Waiting is. What blocks freedom is not duration. It is misreading where change actually happens. When structure is restored, practice stops being something that must unfold someday. It becomes something that can be seen and shifted now. Chapter 4. Why MN8 rejects calm as the book version. If there is one assumption that quietly governs modern Buddhist practice, it is this: calm equals progress. When the mind settles, practice feels successful. When agitation returns, something is assumed to be wrong. Meditation is judged by the presence or absence of pleasant states, and liberation is imagined as a perfected version of calm. Against this background, Majjhima Nikāya 8, the Sallekha Sutta, makes a startling move. It explicitly rejects calm as the defining feature of Sallekha. Why jhana is explicitly not Sallekha. Early in MN 8, the Buddha lists the 4 jhanas, states of deep collectedness, pleasure, equanimity. Then he does something unexpected. He says repeatedly, these are not called Sallekha in the noble discipline. They are called pleasant dwellings here and now. He continues. He lists the formless attainments, even the most refined and peaceful states known in the meditative tradition. And again, he denies that these constitute Sallekha. This refusal is deliberate. If Sallekha meant purification, refinement, or the gradual removal of defilements through elevated states, jhana would be the obvious candidate. The absence of ill will, the absence of restlessness, the absence of sensual desire. It would seem to qualify perfectly, yet the Buddha says no. Why? Because jhana is a condition. Sallekha is a skill. Calm as condition, skill as setup. Calm can arise when conditions align. It can be entered deliberately. It can also be lost just as easily. None of this makes calm wrong, but it does make calm unreliable as a diagnostic of freedom. MN 8 draws a sharp line between what happens to arise and how the mind is configured. Jhana belongs to the first category. Sallekha belongs to the second. This is why the Sutta consistently frames Sallekha not as a state to be attained, but as a mode of orientation. Again and again, the language is directional, bypassing, leading upward, not maintaining purity, not preserving experience. A calm mind can still be pointed in the wrong direction. A pleasant state can collapse the moment conditions shift. Skill, by contrast, persists across conditions. Why pleasant states are not navigation ability. MN 8 quietly teaches a principle that is easy to miss. The absence of defilements is not the same as freedom from their authority. In calm states, defilements may be absent, but absence alone does not mean they have lost governing power. It only means they are temporarily unsupported. The test comes when conditions change. A sailor drifting in calm seas has not demonstrated navigation skill. Skill is revealed when wind shifts, when currents pull, when obstacles appear. Likewise, freedom is not demonstrated by the absence of difficulty. It is demonstrated by how the mind responds when difficulty arises. This is why MN 8 refuses to equate Sallekha with refined meditative attainment. The Sutta is not interested in how the mind behaves under ideal conditions. It is interested in whether unwholesome states can still steer the mind when they appear. Sallekha answers that question structurally, not temporally. What MN 8 is actually reframing by excluding jhana, MN 8 removes a powerful and misleading shortcut. The idea that liberation is achieved by staying in pleasant states long enough. Instead, it shifts attention to something subtler and more durable. Orientation rather than purity. Setup rather than suppression. Authority rather than appearance. This reframing explains why the Sutta immediately turns to directional formulations. Others may be hostile. Here we are not hostile. Not as moral commands, but as establishments of bias. It explains why bypassing is emphasized over elimination, and why the teaching repeatedly points to what leads upward, rather than what must be destroyed. Calm is welcomed, but it is not trusted. Why this reframes meditation entirely. Once this point is seen, meditation changes. Agitation no longer signals failure. Pleasure no longer signals success. States lose their moral charge. Instead, the question becomes structural. When this state arises, does it still govern response, or has its authority already been removed? That is the question MN 8 trains the practitioner to answer, not after years of practice, but whenever experience shifts. This is why MN 8 functions as a diagnostic key. It reveals whether practice is oriented toward managing states or dismantling governance. It exposes whether meditation is being used to escape conditions or to understand how conditions operate. The Buddha is not teaching us how to stay calm. He is teaching us how to be free even when calm is absent, and that difference changes everything. Here is Chapter 5. Sallekha is not purification, fully adapted into audiobook cadence. Chapter 5. Sallekha is not purification, audiobook version. The word Sallekha carries a powerful pull. It is often translated as wearing away, effacement, scraping down, and almost immediately an image forms. defilements as stains to be scrubbed off, impurities to be removed through discipline, effort, or endurance, the mind as something that must be cleaned. This intuition feels natural. It is also misleading. If Sallekha were primarily about purification, about gradually removing defilements until none remain, then the path would be a moral cleaning project. Progress would be measured by how little greed appears, how little anger appears, how little confusion appears. Practice would aim at spotless inner states. But Majjhima Nikāya 8 quietly dismantles this picture. Why wearing away defilements misleads MN8 never instructs the practitioner to eliminate defilements by force. It never treats their appearance as failure. It never frames the task as making the mind pure. Instead, it reframes the issue entirely. The Sutta does not ask, how do we make defilements disappear? It asks, what happens when defilements no longer govern response? That difference is decisive. Defilements arise due to conditions. Their arising alone does not constitute bondage. Bondage occurs when they are taken up, followed, justified, acted from, identified with. MN8 does not promise that anger will never arise again. It trains the mind so that anger, when it arises, no longer has authority. This is not purification. It is disempowerment. The danger of moralistic readings. When Sallekha is read as purification, practice becomes moralistic. Mental states are divided into acceptable and unacceptable. The practitioner becomes invested in appearing wholesome, even to themselves. Shame creeps in. Guilt follows. The mind learns to hide what it cannot eliminate. Ironically, this moral pressure strengthens precisely what the path is meant to weaken: identification. Instead of seeing anger as a conditioned phenomenon, one thinks, I shouldn't be like this. Instead of understanding craving structurally, one thinks, I'm failing. Defilements are no longer impersonal patterns. They become evidence of a flawed self. MN8 offers no support for this reading. Its language is comparative, directional. Others may act this way. Here we orient otherwise. Not accusatory, not condemning. Its emphasis is not on purity. It is on bypass, on leading upward, on release. Moralization is a later overlay, not a feature of the teaching. Nash, appearance versus authority. A crucial distinction emerges here. The difference between appearance and authority. A defilement may appear. That does not mean it governs. MN8 repeatedly undermines the assumption that freedom requires the non-arising of unwholesome states. Instead, it shows that freedom consists in removing their jurisdiction. What matters is not whether anger appears. What matters is whether anger can command speech, command action, command identity. This is why the Sutta emphasizes orientation rather than outcome, set up rather than suppression. The mind is trained so that defilements, even when present, cannot take the helm. This is structural liberation, not cosmetic improvement. The core clarification. At the center of this chapter, and in many ways at the center of this book, is a single reversal. Sallekha does not conquer defilements. It removes their jurisdiction. This sentence changes everything. It explains why MN8 excludes jhana. It explains why effort is redefined. It explains why the path becomes lighter rather than heavier. Defilements lose power not because they are hunted down, but because the conditions that grant them authority are withdrawn. What this changes in practice. Once this distinction is seen, practice softens without becoming lax. There is no longer a need to win an inner war, no longer a need to police experience. Attention shifts from what is appearing to what is being allowed to govern. This shift restores dignity to practice. It removes shame from difficulty. It allows honesty without indulgence. And it aligns practice with the Buddha's actual concern, not the perfection of inner states, but the cessation of suffering. A note on taming and strong similes. At this point, a reasonable question may arise. The Suttas sometimes use strong imagery, taming elephants, training horses, restraining wild animals. Does this not suggest domination? Does it not imply that the mind must be subdued? Only if the simile is misread. In the discourse where the six sense faculties are compared to animals tied together, they are not beaten into submission. They are tied to a stable post. They pull, they struggle, and eventually they settle. Nothing is destroyed. Nothing is suppressed. The post is not violence. It is stability. The problem being addressed is not that the senses are evil. It is that when unanchored, attention fragments. The solution is not hostility toward experience. It is the establishment of a reference point that prevents dispersion. To restrain in the suttas does not mean to crush. It means to prevent what is unskillful from governing action. Strong imagery is used because the stakes are real, but strong imagery does not authorize inner warfare. Read functionally. These similes reinforce the same principle found in MN8. Freedom does not come from eliminating phenomena. It comes from removing their authority. The animals may still pull. They simply no longer determine the direction. Here is Chapter 6, the sailing model. Chapter 6, the structural reading, audiobook version. Up to this point, the work has been diagnostic. We have seen how the suttas are misread, how practice turns into policing, how time replaces structure, how Sallekha is mistaken for purification. What remains is to make the correct reading stable, repeatable. For that, we need a model, not a decorative metaphor, not poetic imagery, but a structure that mirrors the actual logic of the teaching. A model that preserves non-coercion, conditionality, structural leverage. The sailing model does exactly this. It translates abstract terms into functional roles, without reducing their precision. This model will serve as the reference frame for everything that follows. Why sailing? Sailing is governed by conditions. Wind cannot be commanded. Currents cannot be argued with. Weather cannot be negotiated. Force is ineffective. And yet, navigation is possible. This makes sailing a near-perfect analog for the Buddha's path. The path does not promise control over experience. It offers freedom from being driven by it. Sailing preserves the central insight of MN8. Liberation is not achieved by suppressing conditions. It is achieved by removing their authority through proper setup. The structural map. The model consists of 5 core elements. Each corresponds to a key term in the suttas. Each answers a different functional question. Together, they describe a complete system of navigation. No force required. No purity of conditions required. No heroics required. Let us walk through them. Sankappa. Direction. The compass heading. Every journey begins with direction. Before speed, before movement, before adjustment. The sailor determines where the vessel is pointed. Sankappa functions in this way. It does not move the mind. It does not control experience. It establishes orientation toward non-harm, non-ill will, and relinquishment. In sailing terms, it sets the compass heading. Waves may strike from any side. But the boat is no longer aimed at the reef. This is why Sankappa belongs to wisdom. It answers where, not how hard. Setana, orientation, the rudder bias. If Sankappa is direction, Setana is subtle alignment. A rudder is not held rigidly. If you grip it tightly, the boat destabilizes. Instead, it is set at a gentle angle, allowing the wind and water to move the vessel while continuously returning it to course. Setana works this way. It inclines without forcing. It does not eliminate deviation. It prevents deviation from becoming dominant. This is why Setana is not will. Will grips. Orientation biases. This distinction alone resolves much of the strain found in modern practice. Virya, energy, wind availability. Movement requires energy, but in sailing, energy is not manufactured. It is received. Virya functions as availability of energy. The sails must be intact, raised, ready. Without this, the boat drifts. With too much exposure, it capsizes. Right energy is steady, sustainable, non-aggressive. It prevents collapse without demanding acceleration. This is why Virya stabilizes practice rather than intensifying it. Vayama, regulation, sail adjustment. Here is where most misreading occurs. Effort is imagined as propulsion, but in sailing, the wind propels. The sailor adjusts. Vayama is adjustment. Sails are trimmed when the wind strengthens, loosened when it drops, reconfigured when direction shifts. This kind of effort is responsive, not forceful. It works with conditions, not against them. It regulates momentum. It does not try to control outcome. When effort feels like struggle, it has already slipped into will. Yoniso Manasikara discernments. None of the above functions without discernment. Yoniso Manasikara is the ability to read conditions accurately. Currents, weather patterns, obstacles, openings. It sees what matters before crisis arises. This is why wisdom reduces effort. When conditions are understood early, drastic correction becomes unnecessary. The sailor avoids rocks, rather than colliding with them heroically. MN8's emphasis on bypassing belongs here. Wisdom does not defeat danger. It avoids granting danger access. why this model matters. The sailing model does something essential. It keeps the path. Structural, not moralistic. Functional, not ontological. Immediate, not temporal. It shows why calm is insufficient, why purity is irrelevant, why effort naturally decreases as discernment improves. Most importantly, it provides a way to read the suttas without collapsing back into control. From this point forward, every teaching can be tested against this model. Does it set direction or demand purity? Does it bias orientation or enforce control? Does it regulate momentum or produce strain? This is how MN8 becomes more than a single sutta. It becomes a lens. The Buddha was not teaching us to master the sea. He was teaching us how not to be wrecked by it. And when the vessel is properly set up, the journey becomes lighter, not because the ocean changes, but because governance has shifted. Chapter 7, Intention is Not Will, audio version. Among all the misunderstandings that distort practice, none is more consequential than this. Intention is mistaken for will. This single confusion is enough to turn the path from a means of release into a project of self-control. It quietly transforms orientation into pressure, guidance into judgment, training into surveillance. And because it operates beneath awareness, practitioners rarely recognize it as a mistake. It simply feels like being serious about practice. But seriousness is not the problem. Misidentification is. Cetana is not control. In the suttas, cetana is translated as intention, but it does not mean forceful choosing. It does not mean decisive command. It does not mean making the mind behave. It means inclining, setting a direction that shapes what gains momentum and what does not. When cetana is understood correctly, it operates quietly. It does not need constant renewal. It does not require supervision. Once established, it influences response without micromanaging experience. This is why the Buddha can say that intention is kamma without teaching willpower. Cetana determines consequence not by force, but by orientation. Where the misreading begins. The misreading begins when cetana is unconsciously merged with control. Now intention feels like something that must be applied repeatedly, consciously, forcefully. Instead of setting a bias, the practitioner tries to hold the mind in place. Natural impulses are treated as violations. The mind is no longer guided. It is managed. At this point, intention has ceased to function as cetana. It has become will. What will does will grips? Will tightens, will overrides resistance. Will demands compliance. And once will takes over, the mind splits. There is a controller and something being controlled. The controller becomes responsible for maintaining purity. The controlled becomes suspect. This division feels disciplined, but it is unstable. Because the mind cannot permanently suppress what conditions continue to produce, so the struggle continues, and exhaustion follows. Why purity obsession arises? Once intention becomes will, purity becomes the metric. If intention is something I do, then unwholesome intentions become evidence of failure. Anger appears, and it feels like wrongdoing. Desire appears, and it feels like regression. Doubt appears, and it feels like weakness. But structurally, these are conditioned events. They arise when supported. They fade when unsupported. They are not proof of a flawed self. Purity obsession arises not because the Buddha taught it, but because will demands evidence of success. It wants visible improvement, fewer bad thoughts, more good states. But this very obsession recreates what the path is dismantling. A self who must be kept clean. How self-surveillance recreates the self. Once purity becomes the measure, attention turns inward with a new quality. Thoughts are inspected, motives are evaluated, reactions are checked. There is always a subtle sense of being on guard. This feels like mindfulness. It is not. It is surveillance. Surveillance requires a watcher and something watched, a supervisor and a subject. And the watcher becomes increasingly solid, increasingly responsible, increasingly burdened. In other words, surveillance recreates the self. The mind now does double work. It experiences phenomena and simultaneously judges the experience. This is why practice can feel exhausting even when sincere. Nothing in MN8 or in the broader Nikāyas requires this structure. The Buddha does not teach purity through control. He teaches release through non-governance. Defilements are not defeated by being watched into submission. They lose power when the conditions that grant them authority are removed. restoring sadhana to its proper function. The correction is not to abandon intention. It is not to relax standards. It is to restore sadhana to its proper role. Intention sets direction. It does not police movement. When intention is re-established as orientation rather than control, several shifts occur naturally. Unwholesome states may still arise, but they no longer demand immediate intervention. Vigilance softens into observability. Effort decreases instead of escalating. Most importantly, the sense of an inner manager begins to fade, not because care has disappeared, but because care no longer requires control. The path becomes quieter here, less dramatic, more ordinary, and paradoxically more effective. Freedom does not come from willing the mind into purity. It comes from no longer needing to will it at all. Chapter 8. Effort without strain. If intention is the first place where practice quietly turns coercive, effort is where that coercion becomes exhausting. Most practitioners believe, often without examining it, that the path requires sustained exertion. If suffering persists, the answer must be more effort. If clarity fades, one must try harder. If defilements arise, effort must intensify. And yet, the more effort increases, the more strained practice becomes. This is not accidental. It is the predictable result of misreading what effort is for. Virya is not pushing in the suttas. Virya is translated as energy, diligence, persistence. It is almost unavoidable to hear this as a call to push, but pushing is not energy. Pushing is force applied against resistance. Virya functions differently. It does not propel the mind forward. It prevents collapse. It keeps the system upright, available, engaged. When virya is present, practice does not surge. It does not sink. It remains steady. This is why virya feels continuous rather than intense. It supplies continuity, not acceleration. It allows attention to remain present without constant renewal of will. When virya is misread as pushing, effort becomes aggressive. The practitioner tries to overcome the mind rather than support it. Fatigue follows, not because the mind is weak, but because force is being applied where steadiness was required. Vayama is not struggling. If virya is the availability of energy, vayama, right effort, is its regulation. This is where misunderstanding becomes costly. Right effort is often imagined as constant doing, abandoning bad states, cultivating good ones, maintaining what is wholesome. Read temporally and morally, this becomes an endless task list. Something always needs fixing. The practitioner is never finished. But structurally read, vayama is not continuous action. It is adjustment. It prevents certain conditions from gaining momentum. It allows others to stabilize. It does not require suppressing what arises, nor manufacturing what does not. It responds to what is already happening. Struggle enters when vayama is used to fight states instead of regulate conditions. Thoughts are pushed away. Feelings are resisted. Effort becomes reactive. Practice becomes adversarial. At that point, effort is no longer right. Not because it is insufficient, but because it is misapplied. Why correct effort reduces felt effort? Here is a counterintuitive principle. When effort is correct, it feels like less effort over time, not more. This unsettles those who equate seriousness with strain, but it is consistent throughout the suttas. As orientation becomes clear and discernment improves, fewer interventions are needed. States lose momentum earlier. Patterns dissolve before they harden. Effort decreases because leverage increases. Incorrect effort escalates. Correct effort tapers. This tapering is often mistaken for laziness or loss of commitment. In fact, it is the system beginning to function as intended. The sailor who understands currents does not need to row harder. The practitioner who understands conditions does not need to struggle. How strain sneaks in. Strain usually enters through a subtle shift in question. Instead of asking, "What conditions are supporting this?" the practitioner asks, "How do I get rid of this?" The first question invites understanding. The second invites force. Once force is applied, resistance appears. Once resistance appears, more effort seems necessary, and the feedback loop begins. This explains why sincere practice can feel increasingly burdensome even as understanding grows. The Buddha did not teach effort as endurance. He taught it as skillful response, restoring effort to its proper place. Effort belongs between intention and discernment, not above them. When direction is clear and conditions are understood, effort becomes precise, economical, applied where it matters, withdrawn where it does not. The mind learns when to adjust and when to leave things alone. This is why effort is part of the path, but never its center. The path does not advance because one struggles long enough. It advances because struggle becomes unnecessary. When effort is restored to its structural role, practice becomes sustainable, serious but not tense, diligent but not aggressive, steady but not heavy. Strain is not a sign of depth. It is a sign that effort has lost its structure. And once structure is restored, what felt like pushing becomes navigation. Chapter 9, Mindfulness Without Anxiety, audiobook version. For many practitioners, mindfulness is where practice finally becomes overwhelming. They are told, be aware of everything, every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every intention. Nothing should escape attention. Nothing should be missed. Awareness is imagined as continuous, comprehensive, unbroken. At first, this sounds reasonable. Then it becomes exhausting. The mind tightens. Attention turns brittle. There is a constant sense of being on duty, of needing to catch something before it goes wrong. And when something is missed, anxiety follows. I wasn't mindful enough. This is not a failure of mindfulness. It is a misreading of what mindfulness is for. Why watch everything is not sati. In the Suttas, sati does not mean watching everything all the time. It does not mean panoramic awareness. It does not mean total coverage of experience. Sati functions more simply. It keeps phenomena available to understanding. It allows what is present to be noticed without distortion, without suppression, without appropriation. Watching everything is neither possible nor necessary. More importantly, it is not what the Buddha asks for. The idea that mindfulness must be continuous and exhaustive emerges when practice is framed temporally and morally. If liberation is imagined as something that unfolds over time and depends on accumulating correct moments, then missing a moment feels costly. Awareness becomes something that must be maintained without lapse. This is how mindfulness becomes anxious. Mindfulness as observability, not monitoring. There is a crucial distinction here. The difference between observability and monitoring. Monitoring implies supervision. There is a watcher and something watched. The watcher is responsible for catching mistakes, preventing errors, keeping things under control. Monitoring carries tension because failure feels consequential. Observability is different. It simply means that phenomena can be seen when they matter. Sati establishes observability. It does not enforce vigilance. When mindfulness is functioning correctly, experience does not need to be hunted down. Thoughts, feelings, impulses reveal themselves naturally because the mind is not busy managing them. Awareness is receptive, not intrusive. This is why mindfulness, properly understood, feels spacious. When it feels tight, it has been conscripted into control. How Yoniso Manasikara prevents escalation. This is where Yoniso Manasikara, wise attention, quietly transforms mindfulness. Wise attention does not ask, am I aware of everything? It asks, what here is relevant? It discerns patterns, tendencies, conditions. It notices where suffering is likely to be generated and where it is not. Because of this, it allows mindfulness to be selective without becoming careless. When wise attention is absent, mindfulness tries to compensate by expanding. More attention seems safer than less. Effort escalates. Anxiety grows. When wise attention is present, mindfulness can relax. It knows what to attend to and what can be left alone. Effort decreases because discernment has taken over part of the work. This is why wisdom reduces strain. It prevents problems earlier in the chain, before control seems necessary. Why anxiety is a sign of misreading. Anxious mindfulness is often praised as diligence, but structurally, it signals that mindfulness has been turned into a defensive posture. The practitioner is no longer trusting the setup of the path. Intention has become will. Effort has become struggle. Mindfulness becomes the last line of defense, constantly watching for failure. The Buddha does not teach mindfulness as defense. He teaches it as clarity. Clarity does not require tension. It requires conditions that allow seeing. Restoring mindfulness to its proper function. When mindfulness is restored to observability, several shifts occur naturally. Awareness becomes lighter, not narrower. Attention rests more easily on what is present. Fewer things demand intervention. Effort no longer escalates. Most importantly, the sense of an inner supervisor begins to dissolve. Mindfulness no longer asks, "Am I doing this right?" It allows a different question to emerge. What is actually happening, and what is it supported by? That question belongs not to surveillance, but to wisdom. With this, the correction of intention, effort, and mindfulness is complete. We have seen how misreading turns, intention into will, effort into struggle, mindfulness into anxiety, and how restoring their structural roles returns practice to balance. What follows is not a new method. It is a new way of reading, and once reading changes, practice changes. Mindfulness was never meant to make you anxious. It was meant to make suffering visible and therefore unnecessary. Chapter 10. A simple test for any teaching, audiobook version. Up to this point, we have worked carefully through one discourse, MN8. We have seen how a structural reading restores the path to its intended shape. But the value of this work does not lie in a single interpretation. It lies in something transferable. What MN8 gives us is not just insight. It gives us a reading discipline, a way of handling teachings so that they function as intended. This chapter distills that discipline into a simple diagnostic test, a test that can be applied to any teaching in the Suttas. The purpose of this test is not to arrive at the right interpretation. It is to prevent the most common misreadings before they take hold. The test consists of 4 questions. They are not philosophical. They are practical. And the moment they are applied, the teaching begins to function differently. First question. Is this an instruction or a description? This is always the first step. An instruction tells you what to do to change a situation. A description tells you what is the case whether you act or not. Much of the Dhamma is instructional. This should be understood. This should be abandoned. This should be cultivated. These are not metaphysical claims. They are invitations to intervene. But teachings are often heard as descriptions, statements about how reality ultimately is. When that happens, practice turns into belief. The teaching is no longer something you apply. It becomes something you accept. Insight becomes correctness. Correctness becomes identity. Before asking whether a teaching is true, ask whether it is meant to be used. Second question. Is this functional or ontological? Next, ask, what kind of question is this teaching answering? A functional teaching asks, what does this do? What does it support? What does it disrupt? What happens if it is removed? An ontological teaching asks, what exists? What is ultimately real? What am I, fundamentally? The Buddha overwhelmingly teaches in the functional mode. He is concerned with how suffering is produced and how it ceases, not with defining what exists in some final sense. When functional teachings are mistaken for ontological claims, speculation begins. Debate begins. Identity forms around positions. The 5 aggregates become components of a self. Dependent arising becomes a theory of existence. The path becomes a worldview. A simple check helps here. If a teaching can be put down once it has done its job, it is functional. If it must be believed, defended, or held onto, it has been misread. Third question. Is this structural or temporal? This question prevents one of the most damaging distortions. A structural teaching explains how something is upheld by conditions. It reveals leverage. It shows what happens when support is withdrawn. A temporal teaching describes events unfolding over time. Stages, sequences, processes that must run their course. The Buddha teaches structure. Readers hear time. When structure is misread as time, intervention is delayed. Practice becomes waiting. Responsibility dissolves into progression. Instead of asking, how long will this take? Ask, what is supporting this right now? Where could this structure fail? What condition, if removed, would change the whole pattern? If a teaching makes liberation feel distant, inevitable, or dependent on duration, it has likely slipped into a temporal frame. Fourth question. Is this orienting or coercive? This final question tests how the teaching is functioning in you. An orienting teaching sets direction. It biases the system without forcing it. It works in the background. A coercive reading demands control. It produces pressure, surveillance, self-judgment. The Buddha's teachings orient. Misreadings coerce. A reliable sign is felt experience. Orienting teachings make the mind steadier, lighter. Coercive readings make it tighter, heavier. The content may be the same, The effect is not. If a teaching feels like it is asking you to constantly manage yourself, something has gone wrong in the reading. Why this test matters. This diagnostic test does not replace careful study. It prevents misdirection. It stops the most common category errors before they harden into habit. Belief replacing practice. Time replacing structure. Control replacing orientation. Most importantly, it returns responsibility to the present without burdening it with pressure. The Buddha did not require perfect understanding. He required correct use. Once the reading mode is corrected, many teachings that once felt heavy become surprisingly light, not because they are easier, but because they are finally operating as intended. The suttas do not need to be defended. They need to be handled correctly. And once they are, the path becomes what it always was, not a philosophy to adopt, but a structure to navigate. Chapter 11. Applying the Model Beyond MN8, audiobook version. Up to this point, MN8 has served as our backbone. It has exposed the misreading. It has clarified structure. It has stabilized the sailing model. But the value of a diagnostic key lies in its portability. If the structural reading developed here is sound, it should not remain confined to one discourse. It should travel. This chapter applies the same model, without elaboration, without excess, to several central teachings. The aim is not completeness. It is confirmation, to show that what MN8 clarifies is not exceptional. It is representative. Dependent arising. Dependent arising is perhaps the clearest casualty of temporal misreading. Structurally read, it shows how suffering is supported. When certain conditions are present, certain patterns function. When support is withdrawn, they cannot. Each link answers a functional question. What enables this? What sustains this? Where does this gain momentum? But when read temporally, dependent arising becomes a sequence, a chain stretching across time, sometimes across lifetimes. Suffering appears inevitable. Intervention feels delayed. The sailing model restores leverage. Dependent arising becomes a map of currents, not a timeline of fate. The question shifts from where am I in the chain to which condition is steering right now. Responsibility returns to the present without becoming heavy. The 5 aggregates. The aggregates are almost always misread ontologically. Taken as a description of what a person is, they invite analysis. Debate. Subtle identity construction. Which aggregate is consciousness? Where is the self among them? But structurally read, the aggregates mark sites of appropriation, places where ownership and identification take hold. They are not components of a self. They are entry points for clinging. In the sailing model, the aggregates are not the boat. They are places where cargo is mistakenly claimed. The teaching works when it interrupts appropriation, not when it explains composition. The Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is often read as a temporal ladder. First right view, then right intention, eventually right concentration. Progress is imagined as sequential and cumulative, but structurally, the path describes a coherent configuration. Each factor supports the others. Right view orients, right intention biases. Ethics stabilizes, effort regulates, mindfulness observes, concentration unifies. This is not a staircase climbed over time. It is a vessel properly set up. When one part is misread, intention as will, effort as strain, the whole craft destabilizes. The sailing model makes this visible. The 37 factors of awakening. The 37 factors are frequently treated as traits to be acquired, qualities possessed by an enlightened being. This turns them into ideals. It invites comparison. But structurally read, each factor performs a function. Together, they stabilize non-delusion. They prevent suffering from gaining momentum. They are operational supports, not achievements. In the sailing frame, they are not medals awarded at the end of the journey. They are rigging, ballast, sails, elements that make navigation possible and suffering untenable. What this confirms, across these teachings, the same pattern appears. Instructions misheard as descriptions, structures misread as timelines, functions mistaken for ontologies, and the same correction applies. Orientation replaces control, leverage replaces waiting, setup replaces struggle. MN8 is not unique in teaching this way. It is simply explicit. Once the reading mode is restored, the broader body of suttas begins to sound consistent, not fragmented, practical, not theoretical. This is why the Buddha's teaching does not need reinterpretation. It needs correct handling. When handled correctly, it becomes lighter, coherent, usable, and deeply immediate. The final chapter will not introduce something new. It will simply clarify what changes when the suttas are finally read in the category they were always meant to occupy. When the lens is stable, the landscape no longer shifts. Chapter 12. Why the Path Becomes Lighter, Not Harder, audiobook version. Many people approach the Buddhist path expecting difficulty. They assume freedom must be earned through intensity, through endurance, through heroic effort. If practice feels heavy, that heaviness is often taken as confirmation. This must be serious work. And yet, when the suttas are read correctly, structurally, functionally, instructionally, a different pattern emerges. The path becomes lighter, not casual, not careless, but lighter. Less force required, less struggle necessary, less self-management involved. This is not accidental. It is a sign that the teaching is finally functioning as intended. Why correct reading reduces struggle? Struggle is not caused by the presence of defilements. It is caused by misplaced effort. When teachings are misread, effort is applied at the level of appearances. Getting rid of anger, maintaining calm, forcing clarity, suppressing distraction. This creates resistance. Resistance demands more effort. A feedback loop forms. Correct reading shifts effort to the level of conditions. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this?" the practitioner asks, "What is allowing this to govern?" Instead of reacting to states, attention turns to the structure that gives them authority. Once effort is applied upstream, downstream struggle decreases. The mind does not need to be forced. It needs to be properly oriented. Why freedom feels more ordinary, not heroic. Another misconception quietly dissolves here. Freedom is often imagined as dramatic, transcendent, visibly transformed. But structurally, freedom is not a spectacle. It is a quiet shift in governance. Defilements may still arise, pleasure may still arise, pain may still arise, but appropriation weakens, reaction slows, authority dissolves. This feels ordinary, less dramatic than expected, more stable than imagined. The mind is not conquering experience. It is no longer being ruled by it. That subtlety is easy to overlook, but it is decisive. Why effort naturally tapers. When effort is misapplied, it escalates. When correctly placed, it tapers. As discernment improves, fewer corrections are needed. Patterns are seen earlier. Conditions are adjusted sooner. Intervention becomes minimal. The sailor who understands wind and current does not row harder. He adjusts less. The vessel begins to move with less strain. This tapering is sometimes mistaken for complacency. It is not. It is precision. Struggle fades not because discipline weakens, but because leverage increases. The emotional shift. Perhaps the noticeable change is emotional. Tension softens. Guilt fades. Anxiety decreases. Practice no longer feels like constant self-surveillance. There is seriousness, but not pressure. Care, but not control. Responsibility, but not heaviness. This is what happens when instruction is restored to its proper category. The mind no longer fights itself. It navigates. Why this was always the design. The Buddha did not design the path to exhaust practitioners. He did not teach a system of internal policing. He did not ask for heroic endurance. He taught conditionality. He taught leverage. He taught how suffering functions and how it ceases when support is withdrawn. When read correctly, the Dhamma does not increase burden, it reduces it. Not by ignoring difficulty, but by addressing it at the structural level. The path becomes lighter not because the ocean becomes calm, but because the vessel is properly set up. Wind still blows, currents still move, weather still shifts, but governance has changed. The mind is no longer dragged where it does not intend to go. And that shift, quiet, structural, non-dramatic, is what freedom feels like. Conclusion. The Buddha taught navigation, audiobook version. This book began with discomfort, a quiet sense that something had gone wrong. Not in the teachings themselves, but in how they were being handled. Practice had become heavy, effort had become strain, mindfulness had become surveillance, intention had become will. And yet the suttas, when read carefully, did not seem to demand any of this. What had shifted was not the content of the Dhamma. It was the category. Instructions had been heard as descriptions. Structure had been mistaken for time. Functional tools had been treated as ontologies. And once that shift occurred, practice slowly turned into management. But the Buddha was not teaching management. He was teaching navigation. Navigation does not require control of the sea. It requires understanding of conditions. Wind cannot be commanded. Currents cannot be stopped. Weather cannot be negotiated. And yet, a vessel properly set up moves differently. The ocean has not changed. Governance has. This was always the logic of the path. Not suppression of defilements, but removal of their authority. Not accumulation of states, but reorientation of intention. Not heroic endurance, but structural leverage. The Suttas were never asking us to dominate experience. They were teaching us how not to be ruled by it. When this is understood, practice becomes quieter, less dramatic, less burdened. There is still diligence, still care, still responsibility, but the weight of self-surveillance begins to fall away. Effort becomes precise, mindfulness becomes spacious. Intention becomes gentle bias rather than force, and freedom feels ordinary. Not spectacular, not triumphant, simply unburdened. The Buddha did not offer mastery over the mind. He offered freedom from being steered by it. He did not promise perfect conditions. He showed how to live skillfully within conditions. He did not construct a philosophy to defend. He provided a structure to use. The Suttas do not need reinterpretation. They need correct handling. And once handled correctly, they grow lighter, more direct, more immediate. You do not control the wind. You do not command the sea, but you can set the compass. You can bias the rudder. You can raise the sails. You can read the currents. And when the vessel is properly arranged, the journey no longer feels like struggle. It feels like navigation. That was always the design, not domination, not purification, not exhaustion, navigation. And when navigation replaces control, freedom no longer feels distant. It feels possible. Here. Now.